But let me tell you at least the essential ingredients that make up Pastor Reverend Joel Davis. He holds a bachelor's degree in English and in education from what is now the College of New Jersey. He has a license to preach level in biblical studies from Global University and a master's degree in Christian counseling from Philadelphia Biblical University, now called Cairn University. He is an assistant vice president of finance at Pillar College, where he also serves as an adjunct instructor, having taught courses in psychology and counseling, literature, and biblical topics. He continues to conclude that the universe as we understand it is created by God. That's impressive, but Max, having spoken to you when we first came in, I know that you're not intimidated by all of this.
I'm the one who's apprehensive.
We decided ahead of time that we would begin with the affirmative position. Creationism is a sufficient worldview, and we will invite Reverend Davis to the podium to begin our debate.
Thank you, John. Thank you, friends and neighbors and brothers and sisters for joining us tonight, and thank you, Max, very much. And even during this process of getting ready for this evening, Max and I have been able to exchange some emails and things, and that's been a very pleasant and cordial experience, and I thank you.
All right, your time begins.
Creationism is a sufficient worldview. And the word worldview is the key word in that sentence, actually. A worldview is a filter. A worldview is a frame, it's a context through which we react with and interpret data. Everybody has a worldview, whether or not you're specifically conscious of operating within a worldview. A 4-year-old, for example, may have a worldview that mommy and daddy know everything and they feed me. And that's a sufficient worldview for that 4-year-old. Hopefully, as that 4-year-old grows and matures and accumulates more data, some of those assumptions become reevaluated, they get adjusted, and we develop a worldview as we go along. But by definition, a worldview often includes and always includes certain assumptions and things that we take for granted unless we intentionally take the time to examine them and to think about them and to allow ourselves to be challenged. And I assert to you this evening, one thing that I think of myself is that I do not believe the Bible casually. I don't believe the Bible out of habit. I don't believe the Bible because someone said I should. I have been saying, I'm a little bit older than Max, and that in and of itself doesn't prove anything. But I have read the book, I have studied it, but I've read a lot of other material too. I'm a fan of science, I am not a scientist, but this has been a topic that has been very close to my heart for quite a while. And what I've discovered, at least to my satisfaction, is that in all opposing worldviews, these assumptions that are used to draw conclusions often appear to be reasonable. They're not necessarily fantasies or unreasonable assumptions, but they are nevertheless assumptions. When we compare the biblical worldview to other worldviews, what I have found for myself is that the biblical worldview is the one that is the most satisfying, the most complete, the most comprehensive, and that helps me explain more about life than any other competing worldview. The naturalist worldview, the evolutionary worldview, if we want to call it that, really doesn't aim to address any of those questions. It's really just looking at describing or explaining physical material evidence and attributing origins to that. But the biblical worldview offers a narrative that not only provides a context for material information, for scientific data, but also speaks to things like consciousness and psyche and soul. The biblical worldview speaks to things like, why do we grieve when someone dies? Why do we expend great efforts to rescue people, comrades, citizens, soldiers who are left behind? Because there's something intrinsic in our understanding of the value of each human being. A materialistic worldview makes no contribution to that understanding at all. The materialistic worldview simply says we're here by accident. Richard Dawkins, when asked to explain how billions of years of mutations could result in human beings, the best he can say is, I guess we're just lucky. And that's essentially what it comes down to. And that doesn't satisfy me. But the question isn't just whether or not I like the truth. The question is whether or not science and scientific data as we understand it does or does not contribute to or does not undermine certain assumptions upon which I base my worldview. And again, I have come to the conclusion that the scientific data as we understand it, especially over the last 200 years as it's been accumulated more rapidly, has actually served to enforce the biblical worldview, to affirm the biblical worldview, and not undermine it. Not too long ago, the very first verse of the Bible says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, up until the early 1960s, that was a ridiculous comment, because the scientific community all understood that the universe, the cosmos, was itself eternal and infinite, and existed in a state called the steady state condition of the universe. The universe was in stasis. But along came various physicists, a Belgian physicist whose name is on the card on the table, so I don't remember it, who was the guy who actually introduced what we now call the Big Bang Theory. People observed that the galaxies are expanding, they're drifting away from one another. The universe is not static, the universe is in flux, the universe is constantly changing. And through various debates and study, the conclusion came about that the universe, lo and behold, the evidence indicates that the universe had a beginning. Now, how do we explain this? How do we explain what this data points to? Well, we must come up with a naturalist explanation. And so this beginning of the universe must have happened by some accidental naturalist means. But what I look at is, well, okay, there's a point we agree on. The universe had a beginning. My Bible says in the beginning God. The naturalist Bible says in the beginning whatever. But we agree that there was a beginning. And as the scientific data accumulates, what I find, is that the Bible and science ought never disagree. When it appears that the Bible and science disagree, either the science or the interpretation of the Bible are wrong. Everybody who says they understand the Bible, or everybody who has something to say about what the Bible says, isn't necessarily guaranteed to be interpreting what the Bible says correctly. And even as with science, as data accumulates and more information is gained, and the paradigm shifts and the model molds to fit the data, which is how the Big Bang Theory came about, by the way. Well, so with biblical understanding. Up until last century, the Bible talks in a couple of places about a group of people called the Hittites. And the Israelites were fighting the Hittites, and the Hittites were warring with the Egyptians. Well, until 1890-something, that was a laughing matter as well, because no one had ever heard of the Hittites. Encyclopedias described the Hittites as a mythological tribe mentioned only in the Bible. Until 1893, when someone put a shovel in the ground in eastern Turkey and found the Hittites. Well, now that's no longer a joke. Actually, if you watch the History Channel, you can watch hours of programming about the Hittites and their chariots and how they warred with Egypt. So what I observe is that where I see incongruity between what the Bible says happened and, if you will, what science says happened, I've learned to wait a minute. Let's just wait a minute, because today's announcement, how many years ago was it announced that they've now proven, and it's always, we've now proven that the Bible is wrong and there is no God. We've analyzed the human genome, we've analyzed DNA, we have found all this junk DNA, and now we've decided that's proof of evolution because there's all this DNA that doesn't do anything, only for 2 years later for the announcement to be made, well, I guess not. Because now we found out that it hooks to the RNA and does all this stuff. I'm not going to run out and burn my Bible because some guy with a white coat stands up tomorrow morning and says that he's figured something new out. What I will do is reread my Bible to see if what this person has discovered or is asserting to have discovered makes sense within the context of this worldview. I will assert to you, and if we have time, we'll go through some details again. Science and the Bible need not disagree because they both describe reality. Reality is reality. You know, some people say, well, religion covers this and science covers that. Reality is reality. Reality flows from the throne of God and descends down into all these other dimensions. So if something's true, it will withstand scrutiny. Thank you.